Well, welcome to our Wednesday night meeting. This is our May 2022 meeting for the Boston.NET Architecture Group. And tonight we have special guest Udai, who's joining us to present on .NET 6 Deep Dive. Udai also runs a New Hampshire cloud group up in, obviously, New Hampshire. And I know he presented this presentation, there we go, New Hampshire Cloud User Group. And if you're interested, this is available on Meetup. You can go there. Nashua UG, thank you, on Meetup, and be able to join there. And he has a lot of other presentations he's given and speakers and so forth, as well as, at least currently, it's been remote or online as well. Although I think, as you mentioned, he was just a moment ago, we may be going to a hybrid model as we may be doing as well. But check it out. And again, really glad to have you today to come speak to us tonight on this topic. I mean, our focus is primarily .NET and .NET architecture and learning about the tools and how can we get better at as developers, but also architects. And of course, one way is really to understand the tools we're using, and especially the newest one, .NET 6, that was released late in 2021, along with Visual Studio 2022. So this is a fantastic opportunity. Thank you again, Udai, for joining us. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to stop my video, but I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Nice to be here. So today's topic is going to be a .NET 6 deep dive. This is a little bit about me. My full name is Udaiappa Ramachandran. You can call me Udai. And as I said, I'm going to turn off the stream too, if you don't mind. You can call me Udai. I work for a company called Acumina in New Hampshire, Nashua. As a CTO, I also handle security and data privacy point of view. I recently, January 2022, I've been awarded as a Microsoft Azure MVP. I've been using the cloud for last 10 plus years, primarily focused on the Microsoft Azure, and I do have a good experience in Amazon Web Services and Google's built a SaaS product on all three clouds. I run this user group called Nashua Cloud User Group. As he said, like, you can go and visit the page, Nashua UG. I welcome you all to go visit and sign up. That's my little personal site, udai.io. You can find my updates over there. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about the .NET 6, all about .NET 6, and we will briefly intro into MAUI UI, which is the multi-platform app UI, .NET MAUI. We will see where you can download the packages, and then what are the CLI commands and some IDEs, high-level language features, but those are the features we will be using for all the demo that we're going to do today, and explore into .NET 6 ASP.NET Core, and slightly touch the Blazor WebAssemblies and how you can distribute those EXEs, and we will go through the demos. .NET 6, before .NET 6, we have a .NET framework, which is pretty monolithic package. They stopped at 4.8. So .NET framework, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's a 4.8. They stopped it. Then they brought the .NET Core. So .NET Core is main idea is to run in a multi-platform. But now people is hard to adopt .NET Core or .NET framework, but you need some way of writing a code that runs on both platforms. Then you need a .NET standard. If you write a code in a .NET standard, that code can be executed. So you just change the moniker to compile against a framework or core, then you can use the same code directly into a .NET framework or .NET Core. .NET Standard stopped at 2.1. .NET Core, the first release that supports this kind of model, is 3.1. Now they convert everything into a one language called one platform called .NET, right? That's where the 5 came in. But 5 was not a LTS version. LTS stands for lifetime support. We will see it in a second. Then the .NET 6. So that .NET 6 is the great milestone, which is released as of November last year, November 2021. So why .NET 6? It's simplicity. It's open source, right? You can contribute if you want to. And easy to get started. You take a notepad or use any IDE. Just a few clicks, few commands, you're good to go. Just use the .NET command, you're there. It's a developer productivity. You bring any type of workload. It can be a console workload or a mobile workload. Just you type a one command .NET workload. I need an on-try. You got the on-try. .NET workload in the console. You got the console. It's going to bring it in. You don't need to install everything right away to begin with, but you can bring that workload as your demand increase or your project scope changes. It is a modern and core to cloud concept. So you can go from your desktop development environment to a cloud in a few clicks, if that's what you want. Application runs on multiple OS and architecture. It can run in Windows, Mac OS, Linux. When it comes to scale down versions, Android, iOS, tvOS, and watchOS. So this framework runs on all the operating systems. You can also have the application run on everywhere. It can be a web, it can be a mobile or desktop, or AI, ML based, or any data, big data related projects, or gaming, gaming platform applications or IoT based applications. It also runs on the processor, ARM, Intel, or AMD. So that's the cool things about .NET 6. Once you write it, you can run it in any operating system you want to. So, and continuing on the .NET 6, so you can do a package to runtime. Before .NET 6, you will have to install the runtime, but you have some way of packaging it, but that packaging needs mostly some sort of securities. If the computer is a lockdown computer, then you have some securities to unpackaging that, but we will see it in the, down in a few slides later. But to understand, you can package the entire runtime into exe, or you can install the runtime based on the project or workload that you are going to execute. .NET SDK, the SDK, if you take SDK itself, it's a developer SDK, right? You don't need a SDK fully, you just install the component of it. But the .NET SDK, it says, full SDK is required for development purpose, developing, building, running, and publishing the application. That's why you need the SDK. CLI is the command line interfaces that you begin with. Any CLI that you run, it's going to invoke the .NET driver to run the framework dependent path or run any commands that any CLI is going to invoke the .NET driver. But then it comes into a .NET libraries, which is set of functionality built into it, right? So you have a workload called console. There is a set of libraries come into. You have a workload called mobile app set of libraries come into. You have a workload called web. There is a set of libraries come into it, right? And then the runtime, obviously, to execute those libraries. It is a long-term support. Long-term support definition means for 3-year support. So whenever Microsoft stamp LTS, it means they will release any security patch updates for the 3 years. If the product version, for example, .NET 5, there is no LTS stick to it, that means they are not going to update anything. It's your own. It's just a 1-year support, but long-term support means for 3 years. So it's released on November 2021. So you have a 3 years, 24 November, right? 2024 November. .NET Upgrade Assistant, I would recommend everybody moving to a .NET 6, but sometimes it's a hard decision. So you might think that you will have to rewrite everything from the beginning, right? But based on your code base and complexity of the code, the legacy component that you referenced in your project, you can evaluate using the Upgrade Assistant. That's the right tool for you. If you do not have too much of dependency on the legacy code, then you may be able to convert your application into a .NET 6 fairly using the Upgrade Assistant. If you look at the website, .NET Upgrade Assistant, there is about 90,000 downloads. So if your application is pretty decent, say 4.6 or later, then you can use that assistant to convert into a .NET 6. Here is as it supports. .NET 6 today supports on all regions. I see a chat message. Okay, I see you can put this window. App services runs on all regions. So you can build a .NET 6 application right away. It runs on all regions. It runs on Windows and Linux. in the advantage of running Windows and Linux is cost, right? So if you run, you build application now, you can run in a Windows or Linux, but if you run it on Linux, you're going to have a significant cost saving, at least a 40% on a production workload. We had application, everything running on a Windows. Once we convert to a .NET 6 and we were able to go everything in a Linux, we see it 40% cost saving. So if you are a cloud first developer, or your product is a cloud first, or your project is a cloud first, then this .NET 6 can give you some boost on the cost. Static web apps, again, this is another concept. So app service is a dynamic. You can bring any language you want. In this case, we are talking about .NET 6 application. But the static web app is, pretty much as the name says, is static. You can use a JavaScript or JavaScript framework, HTML, CSS, right? So those are three things you can use. The Blazor assembly is slightly different. You build your client application using the C#, which is a server-side code. So you write everything in C#. You compile it ahead of the time compilation, AOT. You can do it, which means that at the time of compile time, it creates that emits all the output. So the other model is a just-in-time compilation, which is when the rendering the browser assembly, it will try to compile that on the client side. So the core difference is compiling on the server side at the time of compilation versus compiling on the runtime while it's rendering on the browser. So Blazor is pretty much runs on the browser. It's a WebAssembly techniques. It can emit the JavaScript for JavaScript, HTML based on your server side C# based language code. And the .NET 6 function API. If you use a static web app, which I said before, it's HTML and JavaScript, but you do have to attach some sort of authentication. You can do that. But if you need some data API, so you want to have some sort of REST services, which you can use a function .NET 6 functions to host your REST API, and then you invoke the REST API securely. The static web app provides you a mechanism to interact securely to read a data. For it can be a SQL data, or it can be some REST, another REST endpoint data, but you can do that. The static web app provides all those functionality, just like Angular routes. You can control the routes and all those cool things you can do that. But in this case, static web app, the .NET 6 come into a picture of either Blazor or a .NET 6 function APIs. The next one is the functions. Functions runtime 4.0, which is the it's called the 4.0 runtime version. The older version is 3.0, 2.0, and 1.0. 1.0 is pretty much dead. We no longer can use. 2.0 is a framework version. 3.0 is the earlier version of .NET. 4.0 is the latest version of .NET. Right? It supports a two mode, in process and isolated mode. In process is your runtime or your library is strictly dependent to the host process. Out of processes, they are not strictly dependent to the host process, but they can bring benefits like fewer conflict. You should be able to version it, fully control of the process. How you do a dependency injection configuration, you have full control. But once a host process in process mode, you lose those compatibility because your runtime is tightly sticking to the host process. And you can also do Azure Container Apps. .NET 6 is a preview mode for Azure Container Apps. Once it goes live, then you can use .NET 6 in Azure Container Apps. Stop me if you have any question, guys. .NET MAUI stands for multi-platform app UI. As we said before, it's a cross-platform, desktop, cross-platform application that runs on Android, iOS, which let you build the native UI. It's an evaluation of Xamarin Forms. So if you know the Xamarin Forms, this is the next version of the Xamarin Forms. You build it once natively, and and then compile against the other operating system code. It's a significant difference is the project structure. If you know a little bit about a Xamarin, it had a multiple projects, Form project, and then you have to create an Android project, and then you have to create iOS project, and then you create a Windows UI, then you have Windows app projects. But in this case, you can have one project, it knows how to compile against the target. Okay, then that can run natively render in all those operating systems. It can deploy into multiple devices, mobile and desktop. Supports operating system, again, Android, iOS, Mac OS, Windows natively, and Windows Universal WP. Data for iOS does the ahead of compilation, as we said before. It's all resolved at the time of compiling the code. But the other one is JIT is at the time of rendering, it will try to do all the work, right? So Data for Android takes advantage of JIT. That's the only difference. iOS you have to do a AOT so that you can register in the iOS store. Apple Store needs that one. But on the Android side, you can do a JIT or partial AOT based on the thing. But you do need a AOT compilation if you have a large application. So you don't want to take the client-side performance. It's going to be very slow if you don't do AOT by trying to do all the work in the client side. So it will take a long time to run it. So based on your project complexity, either you can do a JIT or AOT. So now here is the downloads. If you use a Visual Studio 2022, you don't need to worry about any of these. That brings the ASTK for you, right? So your mission is ready to go. It has everything built into it. But that's your dev box. It can be a laptop or virtual machines, but that's where you need ASTK. You download it. But if you need to run your workload in a production mode, then you're going to select one or more of the other three workloads. Say, for example, you do ASP.NET Core runtime, then you're going to select the latest and greatest ASP.NET Core runtime, and then install it on the server, right? If you run a desktop app, XAML paste, then you going to download that runtime and install it. And if you run a console app, then you're going to run the console app. If you're not sure what you are doing, then probably you can run all three runtimes on your production machines. But if you are developing, definitely you do need a SDK. But from the desktop runtime or .NET console runtime, that's where the single package app come in. You will see it in a minute. You have an option that you can package the runtime, or you can ask a user to install it. If you leave the user to install it, your package will look as tiny as possible. But if you package the runtime, your package is going to be a little bit bigger. We will see it in a minute. Here are the CLI commands. The two commands that you're going to pay attention to the .NET 6 is the watch and workload. So watch is a hot reload. If you use a watch command, you can say .NET run watch, whatever the project you're going to run on it. Workload is you don't have to install everything ahead of the time, right? You start working on the project, and as you work on the project, there is a workload says, and I want to install Android app, then you can say .NET workload install Android, it's going to install it. Right? If you don't know what workload is available, you can still run a command .NET workload search. It's going to find all the workload available. From there, you can pick the workload that you want to install it, right? But most likely you know what workload you're going to use, so you can install that workload when the time to begin that project. Watch is the hot reload. Without you stop and start, as you are debugging the applications, you don't want to start to create a new thread, but now you slightly want to change some value, right? So then you're going to use the watch if you use the command line. But if you use a Visual Studio, we're going to see it in a different way, how you can do that in a hard reload. But if these are the CLI commands that's going to work with the .NET drivers. Next, coming to IDEs. These are the IDEs available from Microsoft website. Visual Studio, of course, I love Visual Studio. I'm sure you all use the Visual Studio too. The latest and is the best, 2022. Visual Studio Code, I use mix of Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. For the server-side projects, we use a Visual Studio. For the client-only project, we do TypeScript, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, then we most likely use a Visual Studio Code. It's not that why we don't use Visual Studio, but it seems like Visual Studio Code is natively best if it does. At least I believe that way. If you use a Mac, yeah, there is a Visual Studio Code for Mac, and there is also a preview version of Visual Studio 2022 for Mac. There is a GitHub code spaces. I believe it's already a general available. You can look at it, and then OmniSharp, JetBrains. And, if you don't need any of these tools, you can still develop using a Notepad and .NET CLIs. Only difference is you have to remember the syntax. how to do that, or scaffolding of any project type. But pretty much you can do anything with the .NET CLI. So you don't need any of those tools if it's a simple project. But definitely you need the IDE like Visual Studio for the big enterprise projects. And then the last one is the IO9. Those are the tools that are available today. The language features .NET 6 and C# 10 FSR 6 released together. And then there was a huge improvements on the C++ side and then the Visual Basic side. But we're going to explore the C# features along with the .NET 6. But we, all our demo. So I have a link towards the end, all the new features. But we will explore most of the features that I like are some of the common features that we all need to know. Right, next to .NET 6 ASP.NET Core, even though we call .NET 6 the ASP.NET Core, and then the entity framework, they still stick to the name called Core. ASP, they are not calling ASP.NET 6. They are not calling entity framework 6, but they still have the tag Core towards the end, right? So why ASP.NET Core with the .NET 6? What brings to you? So reduced memory for ideal TLS connection. Your TLS connection can go ideal whenever the outbound is happening, right? So you have a .NET application, you make an outbound connection, to some website or some SQL server or some Redis cache. So your connection often goes ideal, right? So there is a every time you connection goes ideal, there is a memory attached anywhere from 32 KB to 128 KBs, right? So those are they have a huge improvements. My application, when I have a lot of concurrency come into our application, I see a lot of problems on the DLS connections. It gets slow, and then it start queuing the request. And with Microsoft Azure App Centers, if you don't use everything in a private network, there is a limitation of how many outbound connections can go out, about 150. But you have a lot of connection coming in, they are queued. But here they have a huge improvements how to reduce that memory. And then the memory on the allocation of HTTP request, again, there is a one request, you are not going to see huge difference. But if you have a server that receives hundreds, thousands and requests, then these are very important. And if you do a lot store in the memory, then it is key. Socket connection overhead, when we say socket connection, it can be a web socket, like HTTP over TCP IP, or it can be a client socket that can be used for any type of connections, right? So they reduced how they handle that connection. There is a significant improvements. And the last one is the very important, faster get access. So I can see that, just by converting, in my experience, my application to .NET 6, we were seeing it significantly faster. And also if you're running in a Linux, we see some low cost too. So those are the key benefits you take in the ASP.NET 6 core. The next one is the Blazor. I don't have any demo today, but we're going to theoretically touch this point. Blazor is a WebAssembly released part of the 3.1 core. It supports the JIT compilation. As we said, it's going to compile it on the browser while rendering, or it's going to compile it ahead of the time from the server. But you influence that by using the project property, run AOT compilation true or false. You mainly need to focus on this property. If your workload, based on your workload size, it's a small, medium, large, right? So based on that, you're going to decide that. There's a query string enhancement, how you can pass around the query string. There is always questionable, right? You want to call everything as a route-based convention or the query string based convention, but sometimes you do have to have a query string based convention. If you try to put everything in a route based, your route is going to be significantly high, right? It's a lengthy route. So you may have to come up with some query string. There is some enhancement to it, SVG support, and then the binding option directly into input element of HTML. So you can put the Razor pages and put the CHTML pages, put an input, you can bind to it directly on the Blazor syntax. And then generate the framework specific JS. So if you write a Blazor to support Angular or the React framework, and you can, when it emits, it can emit, you can select the option to emit, Angular-based application or React-based applications. The JavaScript that's going to emit at the end, it's going to be one of those framework. You can select it. Right, now I will start demoing. That's where we're going to spend the rest of our evening now. Any question, guys, before I start demo? Is everybody still there?
Yeah, I don't see any.
All right, great. So here is the project. Again, I'm going to copy this project into my Git repo. You will get a link. I'll put a comment on the Robert the meeting URL towards the end. You will get everything that you see here. This project, my slide deck, everything. You will have a link, a part of that comment section, discussion section, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is, we're going to see a little bit of IDE, very little, 10% of IDE, 90% of the functionality. Okay. The first thing what I'm going to show you is the, it's not a biggie, but if you have lots of project, it may add some benefits. So it's called the set tab layer. Okay. So you can go here, options, and then you can say, if you want to colorize the tab. Okay. So tabs and windows. Yeah. So it's the color button. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, colorize the document by project. So okay, so you can colorize the documents by project. So as you have multiple projects, so you can see which project that you are selecting on it. Okay. So if you look at this, it says the program is CS, right, which is part of the .NET 6 console. Now, if I go .NET 5 console, and I'm going to see a different color, right? Similarly, if I look at the project, so it has, by looking at the color, I can tell those are the same groups. Okay. That's the first one. The second one, what you're going to see here is the project group properties. There are 3 project group properties that the 2. I'm going to talk about that one later. So 2 project group properties. One is the implicit using. So what is implicit using? If you are not using .NET 6 or .NET 5, previous version .NET 5 or older, you will have to import all the namespaces. For example, so I'm going to go back. I open one of the project over here. I don't have any namespaces, right? I still have a task. I still have a time, time only, but I'm not importing any of the namespaces where all those things are there. So if I go back to this project over here, let me open this one for me. Bring the browser here. Right, OBJ webnet 6.0. So if you look at it, this file over here, right? So the project name .global using. So for that particular example, let's go back to console .NET 6. And then I'm going to go OBJ. Debug net 6, and then if you look at it, there is a project name global using .g.cs, right? So if you look at it, I'm opening Visual Studio Code. So this emits all those global uses. As you use them, it implicitly imports, right? So you don't have to say using system.collection.generic using system.io. So you don't need to do that. By setting the tag on the project, .NET taking care of that. But if I'm going to comment in this, I go back to my project over here, and then I save on it. Now I'm going to get yelled that a lot of things is missing. I see that. So it's yelling at me. I don't know what it is, but that's a one location. You don't need to know where the location is, but if you really want to see, that's a one location. But that's the advantage of implicit uses. Right? It knows what to include on. The second thing that we're going to see, the project property, is nullable. Right? So what is nullable? Before .NET 6, it's a reference type by default disabled, right? So it's going to throw the exception, null exception when you run it. You don't know whether it's nullable required or not. It's because it's disabled. You don't know. You're running it, so you get a runtime exceptions. But with the .NET 6, they force by default. But you can set it to a false. But they force by default to check that reference type. What is the advantage? You can now use the annotation context to validate all those things. So for example, you say a name, string and nullable type, but it now validates it, while compiling. Okay, so this is a nullable type. You are not passing it so-and-so place, it may throw the error. So you have a more context given to you where you potentially going to expect the problem in your code. If you disable it, you are not going to see that. But when you go from the previous mode, which is the default reference type disabled to a reference type nullable enable, it may be annoying in the beginning, but once you start using it, you will get the benefit of why it is like that. Okay, that's the second mode that we're going to see it. The next one we're going to see is the namespace changes. So if you look at it over here, we still didn't save this file, I guess. Let me save it. Okay, so if you look at it over here, let's not take out. Not take this one over here. Any question, guys? So if you look at it over here, right, if you build a before, when you create a class, you get it like something like this, namespace, and then you have curly braces, and then you have all those things, right? There's nothing wrong. You can still do the same exact thing in a .NET 6. But if you want to simplify your code, that's where this comes into. So you don't have to do all those things anymore. Simply say namespace .NET 6 Web API .controllers. Okay, but this is called a file scope namespace. What does that mean? You can only use a one namespace in a file. You cannot use a more namespace. For example, you have a .NET 6 Web API controllers, and you want to have another namespace, .NET 6 Web API .controllers.orders, right? You can do it. You have to create another file. But with this convention, you can, pretty much copy paste and say namespace 2. Okay, so you can keep add on it, right? So you have a namespace console 5, you can create another namespace console 6, and so on. That's why it's called the concept itself is called the file-based scope, because this namespace is for this file only. You cannot have another namespace, but in that case, you define like this. So it removes that nested curly braces, keeps your code simple. Okay. The next one, we're going to talk about the global usex. So what is global usex? We saw before the implicit references, right? So when we saw implicit references, we went back over here, right? It has the concept already, global using .g.cs, which does for most obvious runtime references. But you have your own references, which is outside of those most obvious default runtime references. You have a custom assembly called orders. You have a custom assembly called the uses, right? So, but how do you refer them? The most obvious default way that we refer them is you're going to have this using statement everywhere, right? So you can say using, you have something called using, x.y.z and so on, right? If you have the namespace x.y.z. But you have multiple classes. So you have one class over here, you have other class, and that also needs that namespace. And you're going to repeat that x.y.z in another class. You create a new CS file, and then you're going to repeat that. And if you have a third class, you're going to repeat that. You have a fourth class, you're going to repeat that. But what the global using does that, you create a file. That file name can be anything. Okay, so and I call it as global using over here, but this name can be my global using or .NET 6 Web API sample global using anything. But the syntax it's going to look for is the global. As soon as you say global using Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC, that global namespace is applied to the entire project. So nowhere you need to say using Microsoft ASP.NET Core .MVC. The constraint here is you can't have a using before global. The global has to come first. Okay, so you cannot mix both together. So if you want to have a global using and using, the global takes the first precedence. That's the one you have to define first. Okay, so now we defined it. If we want to refer locally, in most cases, this is what we do, right? So we go on to, we go on to do here something like that. But now you look at it, it says it's not required. Why it's not required? It's unnecessary because we already referenced it on the global usage. So now your code is much cleaner, right? So it's already tell you, it knows, hey, you already referenced that namespace on the global namespace, you know where it is. So this is not required. So you can remove it. So your code is clean. Okay. Any questions so far, guys? All right. Next one, what we're going to see is the string interpolation. So if I'm going to use some console samples for that. So I'm going to, right? Yeah. I'm going to comment steps for now. Let me comment everything else here. So if you look at the string interpolation, I'm sure you are using it, right? Mainly where we use is the log, right? So when you want to log, we obviously, someone uses the string dot format, so, if you don't want to write the word is string dot format, you most likely to use the $sign. That's interpolation, right? Convention. In most obviously, if you build an enterprise application or even any application, you're going to have a logging of different levels: info, debug, warning, error, verbose. You're going to have crazy logs, right? In that case, you may pass in a parameter called integer, string, float, and so on. But the interpolation itself is a string. Right? So you're going to pass in a type. So if you pass in this as a string, okay, now you pass in X and Y. So yes, X and Y is a type of string, then it is linear. There is no boxing is happening. So a string, you're adding another string. So it's just a simple string concatenation. There is no problem at all. There is no overhead on CPU. There is no overhead on it. But now it's a string type, but now you are passing in the integer type. So this is where a lot of people don't understand. They write like every line they log, okay, log.info, string interpolation, log.info, string interpolation. A method has like a 20 log.info when you turn it on, but sometimes we are not passing all the time string, right? So we pass the whatever parameter coming in because we are getting used to pass the object type. So those object type now has to be boxed in because this is a string type in a high level, but now you have the integer type 1 and 2. But when you go to the 1 and 2 over here, this has to be boxed in. But the compiler is going to create a type called object. Before, if you take this one over here, before .6, it's going to create, hey, I'm going to do a string.concat, but this can be type of object, this can type of object, but now it's going to box it. The number one integer is going to be boxed to string and then feed into object type. So whenever you refer object type, there is a boxing happen, period, right? Object cannot understand the type, so you will have to box it. So that itself is proven. So when you see the compiler generated code, which I forgot to bring the .NET Peak, but I will run it right now. I use a JetBrains .NET Peak. It's running on my machine, but as soon as it loads, I'll bring it to the screen. So that's a difference. So your boxing has to happen. The compiler generates an object-based boxing code on the earlier versions. For .NET 6, it does a little different. The compiler produces a little different code, which is less overhead on all those things. We will see it in the samples as soon as the .NET Peak is loads. Oh yeah, here it is. So let's look at the code over here. So if you look at the .NET 5 string interpolation, so you see here, right? It boxing it. System type, it knows X is going to be boxed, OE is going to be boxed, and then they are passed into a string dot format of object and object. Got it? And this is the output that you expected. That's the compiler code is created, IL code created by the compiler, right? On the old version. So if you look at the new versions, so if you go back to the root name is .NET 6 console, reference. Sometimes I forget where things go. Okay, so if you look at it, string interpolation. Okay, so if you go, so the IL code. So if you look at the IL code over here, so there is no boxing happening. So this is again, the compiler produces a different way. It returns a type int, then ex, I know we don't need to go much deeper into it, how the compiler does, but in reality, the takeaway here is it's not boxing it, right? So it does a different way of a different efficient way of producing the IL code, which is a less overhead on all those CPUs. Okay, so that's a big takeaway. But I know we all use the string interpolation for logging crazy number of times. So let me dive into next concept. Again, this concept is going to be a IDE based. What we're going to talk about. So let's comment some of the lines here. So we have this run to cursor. When you are setting up the debugger, right? So you have a troubleshoot over here, over here, over here, and maybe over here, right? You run this application. When you say run to cursor, you are technically saying that stop where my cursor is. So it's going to execute everything until where my cursor is, right? So this is a very linear code, one file. But if you're debugging a large project, you don't know where the code is going to, but it's going to come back to where you run to cursor. But what it's also going to do, it's going to acknowledge the previous breakpoints. So if when we troubleshoot a larger application, we don't know what's going on. We're going to set a breakpoint wherever we see it, right? So you're going to set the breakpoint. But you forget it, disable it, or you still want to keep some breakpoint, but it is going to stop any breakpoint before it hits the run to cursor. So if I say right click and then say run to cursor, it's not going to come right away there. Say my breakpoint is going to wait on over here. Let's quickly see that. My breakpoint is going right over here, but when I say run to cursor here, it's not going to come back. It's going to execute the next breakpoint and to come back over here. But if I say run force to cursor, I don't want it to stop any of the previous breakpoint. That's a new one, right? Run force to cursor, it's not going to stop. So it's not going to stop here. It's not going to stop here. It's going to directly come into this line. Okay, but whatever it is going to do, so it's going to do it and directly come. It's not going to stop any of those things. If you look at it, I said a run to cursor, maybe stop. Run force to cursor. Okay, so it didn't stop there. It directly came over here. Okay, so that's the advantage of run force to cursor. The next concept that here is also on the IDE is the temporary breakpoint. Okay, so temporary breakpoint is you debugging a large application. It's given to you, but you don't know where code flow is. But as we go through, we all set like hundreds of breakpoints, but then we go on to undo the breakpoint, right? Oh, I see this line, I don't want it. Then I see this line, I don't want to stop it here. So instead of you going manually, unsetting the breakpoint, you can set that is called the temporary breakpoint instead of temporary breakpoint, right? So once I have the temporary breakpoint, so let's say I have the temporary breakpoint over here, so we don't need to rerun this project. Let's say I have the temporary breakpoint over here, and I have the breakpoint over here. If I run, it will remove the breakpoint completely. So next time when I go and run it, we go over here, but that breakpoint is removed. As soon as the execution path hit the breakpoint, it's going to completely remove from the memory, and it's going to go on the next hard breakpoint. Okay, so that's a benefit of temporary breakpoints. The next demo that we're going to do is the little bit of Lambda. We're going to see it. Any question, guys? You guys still there?
Still here?
Okay.
No questions. Yeah,
great.
no questions.
Yeah. So next one, we're going to see the Lambda, right? So if you look at it over here, you can define the inline Lambda functions like this. So our parse is equal to string yes, and you can say whether it's a string or not, or any type. It's an example. Right. The another way you do is you pass it as an action, and then you pass in a two parameter, you return it. But in this case, you don't need to say this. This can be a var as we define over here, because the Lambda now knows the type of what you're going to return it. So if you hover over there, it will tell you what type it is. So if you hover over there, it will tell you function of string, integer, null, right? It tells you. Similarly, it's hover over here, it tells you what type of function it is. Okay, but you run it, you call message 1 to, it's going to open that action and then compute that and return it. So that's the Lambda types. The next one we're going to see is the defaults. Okay. So I know how many of you use these things to look at first dot default, last dot default, singular default, right? So the default is going to return you a default of the type. If it is a nullable type, it's going to return you a null. If it's an integer nullable type, it's going to return a null. If not a non-nullable type, it's going to return a 0, right? If it is a string, you're going to return a null. If it is an object, the default, you're going to return a null. But now you can pass in what is my default value is going to be, right? So you can say, if you don't find anything first, our default, in this case, it's going to be 0 because it's a non-nullable integer array. But if it is a nullable integer array, then probably you get a null. But in this non-nullable integer array, if you don't find the first element, return me a 40, right? So if I do the first line over here, I'm going to see a 1 because I'm commenting it. I'm getting no element over here. There is no first element. It's going to give me the default value and I'm passing it in. So you can pass in what is my default value. Similarly, last dot default, you can pass in the default value. If you find the last element, give me that. Otherwise, give me that. Singular default. So this is, mostly when you enumerate the arrays, and we always ask, I only need a one item, singular default, right? If it finds a single, it's going to return that or whatever the default, which is not possible before, but now you can set the default value expected instead of returning the base object default type. In this case, integer, you most likely to expect 0, Boolean, you most likely expect a false, string, you most likely to expect null, and any composite object, you most likely to expect null, right? So now you can pass in the default value of yours, the thing that you want. Next thing, what you're going to say is the improvement is the date only and time only, right? So, some contexts, these are very useful. Other contexts, it's not, but it depends how you are designing your applications. You can pretty much, you can get away this functionality just by formatting the datetime, right? You don't need this function, but it's a convention that they provided it, less memory overhead instead of going through that formatter again. There is a boxing, unboxing come into a picture. So you don't need to worry about all those things, but it's a little overhead compiler generator code. If you need a time only, it gives you time only. If you need a date only, it gives a date only. You can pass in any time span or whatever date format you have, right? The next one is the argument null exception. If you are expecting the argument EX, before .NET 6, C# 10, so we most likely to do, X is null, throw new argument null exception, param name, or param of X, right? There's nothing wrong. But it's a little bit OD, right? So you are like a 10 method, and you want to validate, 10 methods. Now you're going to consume 10 into 10 validation, 10 into 1, 2, 3, 4, 40 lines of code. Why do you want to do that? So they provide this convention, argument null exception, throw if null X. Okay, but now you save 3 lines of code. Someone can argue, I can put a curly braces right next to the if statement, or no if no curly braces. That's a different, but no, that's again your coding style. But most people use the curly braces to keep consistent when you have more statement versus the single statement. But in this case, the call stack, if you look at the call stack code, here it looks pretty simple because you get into that, but here the call stack will be 2 lines extra because they have to do this for you, right? So if you look at the call stack, how it's doing, you will have a little bit more here because they have to convert this to this, and then this is going to throw. But you have the convention there you can use. The next one I'm going to, so let's run this one, and then I will take you to some web project and then talk about some dependency injection, other cool stuff. Okay, so I have all these demos set over here. If I run, I'll come back and run this later. Let's explore a little bit more here, just to save some time. The next one I'm going to show you is the dependency injection. Right, so let me go back to our dependency injection over here. For that, you can use a dependency injection over here, but let's look at the web API project. This applies to even if you have a project, but using the .NET 6. Okay. So what is a dependency injection? You can inject your implementation, right? So you completely decoupling your implementation. I have iUser service as a mock. There is nothing, it's not a great code, but at least it solves the problem. So I have some, some method here, get by ID, get, add a user, save, which is update, which is going to be technically a put object, and then delete, which is going to be delete object, add is going to be a post object, get is going to be a get, and get is going to be again a get. So that's some interface we have it. And then we have some implementation over here. Again, this is not a great code, but it at least solves the demo and understanding of the concept that we're going to explore. Okay, so we have some object and we have the implementation. Get, we're going to return the user, which we create on the constructor in the get ID. We're going to find the ID match, and then we're going to return it, and then add, we're going to add to that collection, and then save, we're going to remove and update. Again, this is a sample code, not a production code. Okay. Now we here, if you look at it, we have the user object, right? So if you look at the user object itself, you can create a user object in a pretty classic way that we did like this. There is nothing wrong, right? So there is nothing wrong with it. I have to comment these two for now, right? But that's how we create. We put a constructor, if you want to pass it in, or if you don't want to pass it in, somebody can create a new user ID equal to name equal to emails. But now with the latest one, you can get into this conversion. Either it can be a record or it can be a structure. All three syntax works pretty identical, but the first syntax is pretty wordy. You now take line number 9 through 20, which is about 11 lines, right? But here you only use one line, just like how you will use a tuple concept, without creating the class, you just say what the property and type, right? So it simplifies it how you want to do it. Either you can use a record as a class or record as a structure. It doesn't matter how you use it. In this simple example, it's going to work. Okay, but for us, we will use record as a class because we got a class over here. But again, see here, if you use this new class over here in this program, in the implementation over here, we pass the constructor, right? User of 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you look at the user object here, we don't have a constructor, but still knows, okay, this is the constructor. You pass it in, it knows all those things. Okay, that's another concept that I wanted to show here. Now again, API response is the mock response class. We can return as a user, our content, our order, our shipping, or whatever you want it. But in this example, we can call generic data called the API response, and we're going to pass it as a T as a generic, and then we're going to see it. So this way, if you write an API, but again, it's everybody is different, everybody uses a different convention, but we follow this type of things. API response is the one object that data has its type. So if I want to pass a user, then the API response has a data of type user. The API response is data of type, orders or shipping or whatever you name it, your TTE object, data transformation, TTO object, data transformation, or NDT. Okay, you can also add another property. For example, you want to send to the performance metric. For example, how long this, on a debug mode, you want to see how long your code took to execute, to execute this method. You can have another property by defining as a one core response, bringing the data as a part. You can also have, but this is not a .NET concept. This is a generic concept. This has nothing to do with the .NET. Okay, I'm just saying generically why API response of T is here. You can have exception, or you can have some performance metric, how long this took, and all those things. You want to ship it on a debug mode, you can add those properties and implement it and ship it. So people see in the API response, they will also see other properties based on the execution mode. Again, this is for sample, nothing to do with the .NET. All right, now let's get back to what we were talking about, the dependency injection. So I go back to my project over here. So this is how I have the interface, I have the implementation. But now I want to have another implementation that really talks to the SQL Server to get all the data. Yeah, I may be having the user SQL service or SQL user service or SQL data and so on. But now I can inject that over here, right? So here I'm injecting it, but you can have a configuration file, read it and inject it on the programmatic. But for this is a very simple demo. So we see the injection. we see the injection, add scope, user service and user service. There are different way of creating the instance. When you say add scope, new instance is created every request. So once you have, for example, get my orders, right? So you're going to say API/order/get. Okay, so that's a request. That's a request, a request, right? In that request, you may use these instances multiple times. You hit the controller can invoke another service. You're talking to me? You're talking to me? Hello? Guys, you there?
Is there a question?
Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, somebody was talking to me. I heard my name and then.
Yeah, is it Ravi? Did you have a question?
Oh, he was talking to somebody else, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, so add scope, you can say add a transient or singleton, right? So if you do a logging, you most likely is going to say add singleton because you don't want to create an instance of logging, implementation every time, right? So you create a once and that's the instant passed across the request, right? The transient it's always create. So let's see add scope. Scope is created once per request. So you come in and get orders at that time created, but in the controller you call another service, same instance is passed around. The transient is as you move around, a new instance is created within the same request. Okay. In some cases you may need a transient. The other cases you don't. But add scope is will solve. If you have the user context, right? But if when the request come in, you need to attach a user context, then the add scope is more than enough. But you can go add transient. But singleton, when you attach the user context, you don't need a singleton because now you login versus me login system need to differentiate. You cannot create an instance of singleton in that case. So singleton best example is a log, right? So you go and log the logs, and that's singleton. Okay. Now, if you look at this line of item here, number 6, we have user interface. We say the implementation is user service. Okay. Now, if you go back to our user controller, which is our controller over here, when we call this controller, so the controller is the convention. So API/user. Okay, it knows the remove the part controller. We use this pattern. Or you can hard code if you want to call XYZ, then you remove this convention, call it as XYZ. So this is how you inject user and service. And the runtime, when you call the method, API, it's going to invoke the constructor because it needs to create an instance and it's going to pass in the user service. Then you have the user service, then you call the method. But in the target 6, you can do this. You can pass that injection via method properties. Okay, this is a from service. From here, you can pass it in, right? So now you can pass in a constructor or you can pass in a method service. So if you have another parameter, you're going to have all the parameter, you're going to have a string X, I'm going to have an integer Y. So you can have it, but the first parameter has to be your injection parameter. Okay. So if you have like one method that needs this injection, which is not, let's say you have like 2 implementations, user and order, right? So you can pass it in user and order over here. But the only one time, you use the user all the time, but there is only one time that you use the orders, right? So you have like a 100 request, 90 of the request goes to a user, only 10 requests go to order. Then why do you bother passing, pass out the constructor? So you can pass it in on demand, right? When you hit that method, right? So you don't have to create that instant passing it around and so on. So that's the, cases like that you can use it, or you have a one injection required in one particular method you can use it. But the key takeaway here is you can inject part of the method properties. Okay, we will test it while we're trying to run. I'm going to compose 2 concepts over here before I run this one. The next one that I'm going to show you is the hot reload. What is hot reload? As you debug the application, you have to be in a debug mode. You want to see, you see something, you see the value, you set it, everything is loading fine, but now you have to change it, right? It was previously called, edit and continue mode, right? But now it's a hard reload. But this, it will not change the thread, but it will do everything on the same thread. Okay. You can slightly change the value, and then you can see it's reflecting immediately. The hot reload can work on any server-side code, console app, or the CSS file, or the CSS HTML views. You can modify any of those places. The only time it will not work, there is a concept called isolated CSS. So when you create a CS HTML view, you can also create a CSS part of that view. So you have big application, but particular views that you want to load in a different CSS. For example, log out and log in, right? You don't want to load the entire view. You want to do a slightly different on the log out and login views. Yeah, but you can create that isolated CSS. But the hot reload cannot work with those isolated CSS. But if you have global CSS, it will work. If you have CSS inside the CSS HTML, it will work. Any server-side code, it will work. Any console app, it will work. So let's run a demo and then see what it is. So for this demo, I'm going to run this code over here, debug start new instance. All right, so probably we'll be invoking something over here. Yeah, over here. There is. So when I created the project, I loaded the Swagger so we can test it. So you see it over here, right? So you go try it now. So this gives you a little convention. Otherwise, you have to get a web project implementation, all those things, but you get the concept. So now what I'm going to do, if I look at it, the code over here. So if I go back to my user controller, I set a breakpoint. This is what you're going to look at it, right? So this is going to use the global, but you can still see there is another instance passed over here. So if I go back and then hit that method, execute, I see the code is executing over here. Now we got it. So if you look at it, if you look at the user service, yeah, .NET service, now we have the implementation and it's the same thing, right? Now we're going to return the data. So if I look at our response, yeah, those are the three data we have, it returns it. So now we want to add something, try it. Now we still post, like, let me say 4, and I'm going to say Boston, the group, and then execute. Yeah, I got one, and then I do see ID. I want to look at it. The latest ID that we add is a 4. You're going to say 4, and then execute. We get the one that we just added, but you got the concept. Okay, so our primary aim is not to test all the APIs, but you got the dependency injection is what. But now what we're going to do, debugging hot reload, right? So before I do a hot, okay, so let's do a hot. So you got this over here. So we're going to stop it. So now, before I do a hot reload, let me talk about a little bit of the minimalized API. So if you look at this project over here in the program, right? So we have all those things, okay? But we also have a controller, right? So you have the controller, I have the HTTP get by ID, HTTP get post, HTTP put, and then the delete, all the verbs we have implemented. But this is critical. If you have lots of controllers, lots of REST API, this may definitely make sense. But if you have some handful of REST API, do you still need to do this way? You don't need to. So that's called a minimalized implementation. So if you look at it over here, you can have something like this defined on the program.cs itself. So you can say, I have a route called the users, which I'm dependency injection, I user service, and then I say, get users async of user service and passing in the instance that passed in. So if you look at it, this is what I do. Okay. No, sorry, this is what I do, right? So I get the user service data and so on. Okay. And similarly, you can define. This is called a minimalized API. So you're not writing a lot of codes, but this may get overwhelmed or more complex to maintain your code base if you have, like, as you can see, there is only a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 5 methods are there. But what if you have 50 methods, right? Then you have to have all these things, it might get a little bit confusing, right? It may not make sense, but in that time, we can still go back to the, creating a more controller based classes. But if you have a simple project, maybe a handful of Western points, you can do this as well. Okay. So now we're going to do something over here. Before we run the demo, let me also talk about the HTTP log. Okay. So what is HTTP logging? So if you run this, you can enable the logging for the for your application, right? So how do you enable the HTTP logging? You just call this number, use HTTP log. But how you knows what level of logging that you want to set? There is a logging level, so you can set which framework component that what level you want. You want the information level. If you have a log.information, it's going to, anything that logged beyond the information is going to bring it over here. If you say error, right, it's going to bring error and critical. If you say warnings, right, so it's going to bring everything from the warning, debug, error, and critical. So you got the concept, right? So that you can, leave information for now. So the IDE gives you all the, so you can do that. Okay. The next one I'm going to show you is the async enumerable. So that's a key feature. Again, another key feature over here. What is async enumerable? So if you look at the code over here, let's go back to this implementation over here, right? So async enumerable, it's not going to wait for, so you have you want to return a stream, right? So you want to return like a enumerable data. It can be a data integer or string or a stream, any type of data, but you don't want to wait for everything to be done, return directly into the, send it to the client. But enumerable async let you send to the stream or data as you receive. Okay. So what is the key advantage? You get a better response to the user. You engage the user. He starts seeing the data instead of waiting for all the time the data to be processed. To say it takes like 10 seconds to find the 10 different data. Now they start seeing the data every 1 second. Some data is coming in, so you get a much better engaged audience, right? They're not bored staring at the empty screen for 10 seconds, right? So that's async enumerable. You can get that. Another feature that I want to talk about over here is the parallel async. Okay, that's something new. So to talk about the parallel async, I'm going to go back and I will run the demo of all those things together. I'm going to go back my console AP, parallel. So parallel for each. The parallel for each, what it does is it executes your code in a parallel, but within the code is synchronized, right? So once you call this method over here, okay, it's not going to be it's going to wait. So for example, so to explain a better way, if I land the parallel sync method, which is the parallel dot for each, it's not going to come back to the next line, which is this line, until all of the parallel actions are completed. Okay. This action can be anything. For demo reasons, we have some array of integers, but in a real world sample, and I will give you how I use it. I have to propagate file changes to other regions. So we have configurations and lots of configurations and pages and some data we store them in a blob storage. You are trying to use the blob replication, but that end up the secondary being read only. So then we realize it's not a good idea. So we start replicating ourselves. So when we replicate, we consider one as a source. As the source change in the stream comes in, and then we run the parallel task to push the data to more regions, right? So for example, East is the primary. I have a secondary running in West, Europe, India, you name it, right? So we run this parallel, so it speed up the process. But the next, we also have to run the same time clearing the cache, right? So now I'm talking about the two set of actions. Every action has a list of actions, right? The one set of action is the copying a blob, but the list of action within that array of action is the copying blob to multiple storage locations. The other set of list of action is, as I copy, I also want to expire the cache because we don't run a centralized cache due to a latency. We run caches on every edge locally because our application is pretty highly scalable enterprise. So we run a cache locally, but this kind of centralized data change, we propagate the local cache to be expired. So the problem of centralized cache is when we route a request from west to east, it's pretty pain. There's some latency attached, right? So we do that way. In that mode, we do a parallel, but again, this has to wait. But if I have to run both together, and this is some way I can run it. I can say parallel async propagate cache, parallel async propagate files changes, parallel async expire caches, right? So what the advantage of running this way is not going to wait everything's to be completed. While it's running, it's going to leave the main thread, so the main thread can do other actions. Okay, it can continue and resume process all the data. So it's not going to block the thread. So when the parallel async is going to run by its own and your main thread is released, it can go to the next line. Okay, so that's the parallel async. The next concept that we're going to see is program versus startup. If you look at the 3.1, okay, you used to see a 2 file. So I'm going to bring one of my live project. I didn't have samples over here, but I'll bring this project over here for a brief moment of time. We have the program, right? But we also have a startup. Sometimes it makes sense to keep startup to be different, or if you already had something is done, yeah, this is the right way to it. But you can you invoke that? Yes, you can invoke that. Just from the start method, you just run the web host, and then you say the build it, and then you pass in the startup class, and it's going to call the startup class. Before this program.cs is a minimalized. They call it as a minimalized coding. But if you already have a startup class, you don't need to rewrite everything to bring into program.cs, but you have that convention to call them, so it can still execute your startup.cs to bootstrap your application, and you can have everything, all the services and routes and everything different over here. Okay. The next concept that I'm going to talk about is the file stream. Okay, so they have a huge improvement on a file stream. How you read the file stream is called as a file stream async, without blocking. When you read a files over and over and over and over, there may be some overhead blocking can happen. But with this new implementation, you don't need to worry about it. They according to the articles, they significantly optimized how the read can happen. Okay, let's run this demo before dive into other piece of components. Robert, how are you working on the time? You okay?
I think we're okay. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, we're probably about, we're 1.5 hours in now. What are your thoughts?
I can go for another 15-20 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's say 10-15, if that's okay.
Okay, 15. Okay, all right. Then I'll quickly run this. Then we'll go back. So minimalized API. So I go back over here, tbek start instance, a site over there. So and then also I will show the demo of the hot reload. Okay, so if you want to enable a hot reload, you have to do it over here. If you run this from the console, you can use the command run watch. But now I'm using IDE, you need to enable it. So how do you know the hot reload is working? So you got to check this hot reload. It'll tell you the hot reload is working or not, right? But now I have this method on a get data. If you look at my method over here, I'm going to click on the get data sync, right? That's what I'm mounting it. I'm going to go back over here, try execute, and then execute that. It's going to hit the function, right? Now I'm going to say, let's run it first, so you know the difference, right? So let's go back here, run it. Okay, so I have 14, 0 to 14, which is the 15 rows, right? Now I'm going to rerun it here, execute. Now I'm going to edit this to a 10. Okay, now since I have a hot reload and I enabled the hot reload on a save, this file is right now in edit mode. Now watch what is happening over here. You see this little flicker happen, right? Now I'm not restarting anything. It runs on the same thread. If you look at this, if you output the thread, you probably know the thread is not changing. Now I run this function. Now, if you look at my output over here, it went to 0 to 9. So you are not stopping anything. Thread is not changed at the same thread. And at the same time, I also explained the minimalized function how you can run it. And then let me quickly run the parallel async and the other stuff here. So let's go back to this demo over here on the console, right? So I have the parallel async, it's going to run it and parallel, sync and then async, and we can remove all the breakpoints and then run it. So if you look at it over here, it's not, oh, it's already passed it, but it's already came in over there, but you got the concept. So if you look at my console, you don't see the output of the parallel async yet, but that will happen as it runs through. It will happen. Now you start seeing it. It's running on it. So see that now is this output from the parallel sync, this output from the parallel async. It triggered it, but it happened sometime later, right? So that's a concept. The next concept that I want to demo is the preview feature. Okay, what is the preview feature? Microsoft also let you explore some of the preview features. So you can play with it, but how you can enable the preview features. I have a class cloud preview demo, right? This uses some math operation, which is still under preview, but I need to take advantage of it, and I need to enable the preview features. I enabled it, so I don't see any problem. So if I go to comment this one, I save it, I go back to my preview demo, it yelling at me, hey, this is the preview feature. Okay, you can use these preview features, but in order to use it, you have to enable these free features. But again, nobody recommends, I wouldn't recommend that you use these free features for production, but you want to explore beforehand, yeah, this is the right choice for you to do it. The last one we're going to see here is the package, distribution, right? So what is a distribution? So we have the console.exe over here. We're going to go and open a little command window, CMD. So I'm bring a distribution over here. So it's a true single exe. You can do a single package in the before version too, but the before version it is a zip, you need to extract it to a local machine. If your local machine is tied up on a security that you don't have privileges to extract or use a temp location, yeah, it's going to throw error. You can run it, right? But this is a true single exe means that you're going to, it extracts on the memory. Okay, so it's going to use the memory. And then it also has the everything on the memory, IL trimming. What is IL trimming? You may have lots of references added to it, but it knows how to trim those references based on how you referenced it. It will remove all the libraries which you are not using and so on. Not all the project type will work on this model, but most likely you can. If you pack, I can show you in a simple project how it significantly saves that size. The third one is the compression. So you can also compress it, but the downside of compression is if your application is pretty big, but when you're trying to decompress it down in memory, the boot time or the load time will be significantly high. But again, that significant high is going to be based on how big your application is. Okay. The fourth option is publish with the .NET Core runtime or user runtime. When you say publish with the .NET Core runtime, your user doesn't have to install that runtime. You package it together, okay, and then it will run it. And the other option is the user installed runtime. That means that the user needs to have all the runtime installed. Okay, so here is the syntax that .NET publish single exe true, and you have to specify the platform mode, and then you say self-contained false means when this package is created, you give it to a user, and then the user needs to install that runtime. When you say self-contained is equal true, it's going to package that runtime, and now you tweak a little bit more parameter to reduce the size. If I don't give these two parameters, my size most likely for this simple console application is going to be 62 megabytes. By trimming, it can come to a 10 megabyte, the 30 megabytes. By applying the compressions into a single file. Now, by applying these two together, my size will be at 10 megabytes. Okay, so let's quickly run that. So for that, I'm going to open a command window. So I'm going to go back to this location. All right, here's an location. Right, so I'm going to say copy this command over here. Hopefully you can copy it. Right, so let me take a little bit time. I'm sorry, I'm holding you guys beyond 7:30. We should be done shortly. But if you go back to the output over here, so I go back to .NET console, bin release, that's where we said, right? And then you go to the process of the ask, you go back to the publish. Still not done yet, but you know, you can see the sizes. Oh, what happened? And we combine it first time. I think we were changing out of type, so I have broken something. Oh yeah, I didn't save the project after changing the changing the preview mode. Okay, that's a problem. Save on. Okay, so let's run this one. Okay, so if you look at it over here, you know, it's 10 megabytes, right? Because now I enabled the compression, I enabled the IL trimming. Now I don't have to give anything. I can just copy these and then go to a machine where I don't have a .NET 6 runtime installed. It will just run. I don't have to prove you, but trust me, it will just run. So if I change some of the option over here, you know, I remove the IL trimming now, right? I only see a compression, right? So if you look at it, this file size will go slightly bigger because we now remove the IL trimming, so it goes to 33 meg, right? So and then if I remove even a compression out of this thing, then you look at it and it's going to be 63 meg. But even if I remove the single package is equal to false, okay, so I say that contained is equal to false. I remove this switch and then say I'm going to say false over here. But now this exe got tiniest possible. But that's because now you have to install all that. Okay, so that's the last trick that I have, and I will add my you know, I have my code in Git. I will add it, and then I will I will put this link in the comments on the same meetup page tonight. Anything else, guys? I think that's the last demo I have, but if you have any question, I'm happy to answer. Robert, you want to take it?
Yeah, any questions for Udai? Thank you, this was great. We'll get some comments. Great presentation. Okay, any questions? All right, we'll go ahead and close. So thank you again, and really appreciate it.
You want to stop recording if you're not done yet? All right, thank you guys. No, it's my pleasure.